All right, so I want to talk a little bit here this morning about the definition of success. How do you define success? I mean, I don't know. I think we all define success very different ways, but I think that the real knowledge of success, the real being of success, is something a lot different than what most people think of success as being, right? So if we think of success, if I ask you to think of what success is, you're probably going to say a stable job, a permanent address, maybe diplomas hanging on the walls, right? A house filled with things that marks our achievements and show that we've made it, right? This is what success is, right? Maybe it's furniture, maybe it's cars, maybe it's photos, maybe it's diplomas and degrees and all this other stuff that proves that you're a success, that you were here and that while you were here, you accomplished a lot of things. That's success, right? So you go out and you become a lawyer, you become an accountant, or you become a a craftsman or a tradesman or whatever it is you become. You work towards success to be very good at that thing. So that way somebody eventually will know that you were here and that you existed, right? Generally, most of us, we follow a very well made plan, a very well thought out plan of action, right? So we go to school, we go to college, we get a university degree, we get a job, we become an accountant, a secretary, a doctor, a lawyer, whatever that is, we become that. And then we spend the rest of our life doing things, leaving a mark, leaving a place, leaving traces of who we were and what we were and all that. That's life. Okay? That's the well-made plan, the map to success. And you hear a lot of people talking about this map of success, right? That we should all follow. But what happens when somebody completely walks away from that map, from that plan? When they just say, "No, thank you, I'm going to live differently. I'm going to go a different route with my life. I'm not going to follow the well-made plan." Every day people say no thank you to this. They just walk away from it. They give it up, right? One of the interesting characters that I looked at recently was the great chef Marco Pierre White, right? And how he gave back his Michelin stars. He just walked away from it. And he said something that really was profound to me when I was listening at this interview about why he did this. And he said, "I would rather cook for people that I love than cook for people with a wallet." There's freedom in that, but he's walking away from this plan of success that showed that he was here. Why would you do that? Why would you walk away from being a chef, a lawyer, an accountant, a bank executive, an engineer, an architect, whatever the case may be? Why would you walk away from all of that and just say no thanks, I don't want it? It's really an interesting concept. So some people choose to walk away from owning businesses, working at the bank, whatever it is, law degree, in favor of nomadic journalism, whatever it is you do, right? Okay. You walk away from that. Okay. And then you go to live on the road. You go to live in a van. You go to ride rail cars around the country illegally, right? Whatever it is. You spend your life hopping freight trains, or maybe you go and you buy a little farm out in the middle of nowhere and you become a farmer, or whatever it is. You trade in the successes of life to make just enough to survive, just enough to get by, right? And then you use the rest of this time to see the world, to make art, to live slowly, to really appreciate life around you. And you don't have to appreciate things as much, right? Maybe they go on YouTube and they record videos for millions of people to watch. I mean, hundreds of thousands of videos. But they're creating a legacy that goes beyond things and stuff. One great innovator of this genre of art and this lifestyle that comes to mind is the YouTuber who passed away in 2024, Hobo Shoestring. You know, this guy was a smart innovator, a thinker, absolutely brilliant. And at first glance, you might look at Hobo Shoestring, somebody like him, and think that Mark Nichols, which is real name, went by Hobo Shoestring. You might think that he's just a dropout of society, that he's given up on life, that he's given up on everything. Instead, if you look more closely at Hobo Shoestring, you start to see the portrait of somebody else who lived, a very different persona than what you and I normally see today. You see a guy who's an innovator, who's a storyteller, who's a philosopher. You see a guy who's practicing philosophy by living differently. And this asks all of us the question about whether we need to rethink what it is the words freedom, success, belonging, and creativity really are to us. What does this really mean? What does freedom mean? What does success mean? What does belonging mean? What does creativity really mean to us as individuals? And this is where we begin to think objectively and critically about these things. Now, what I'm doing here is this course. This course is not just about glorifying poverty. Okay, I'm not saying that. And I'm not going to sit here in this course and romanticize hardships. Okay, you could argue that that would be stupid to do, right? And let's just say that you're mildly considering walking away from, the academic career to do this. That's probably not the most smart move for most people. But instead, what can we learn from these people who did this? Because if we look really closely at the margins of society to see what the margins reveal about us in the center of that we're not living this life of poverty, but we're not living this life of success in the portrait of the American dream either. We look at these fringes and these fringe group people, whether it's a hobo on the rails, whether it's somebody doing van life in the desert, or a minimalist in a city apartment, whatever it is, we begin to look at these things very differently, and we can ask big human questions, real human questions about life. And it goes back to that, right? Asking those key questions. Number one, what does it truly mean to live free? Away from the societal norms, away from the politics, away from the expectations, away from all of this stuff. What does it truly mean to live free? What are we giving up in exchange for stability and for comfort in our own lives, right? Where do things like innovation? This is another question that these people cause you to ask yourself. What does things like innovation and creativity, where do they really come from within us? Do they come from abundance or come from constraint, right? This is something we should be asking ourselves. And also, I think that we should look at what it means to belong, to contribute, to participate in civics, in life, in government, whatever it is. Have you stepped outside of the traditional systems, whether they be in your career or I vote Democrat, I vote Republican, whatever it is? These are the traditional norms. Are you thinking outside of those norms? Are you challenging the traditional systems? This is a legitimate question. And hopefully, as we take this course and we move into this thing, we're going to have deep discussions about this because we're going to explore these questions and we're going to look at readings from people like Henry David Thoreau, Walden, one of the great books. Bell Hooks. Some of you probably never heard of Bell Hooks. Maybe, David Graeber, talking about the modern existence of jobs that nobody wants to do. You remember this show on Discovery? I think it was Dirty Jobs or something with Mike Rowe. These things get you to thinking about what other people do. And maybe they're not living on the fringes of society, but they're not living the portrait of the American dream, but they're doing something really impressive with their life. So throughout this course, throughout this idea, we're going to examine this whole idea of what it means to live on the fringes. Okay? Now, the first one that I want to talk about a little bit here this morning, because I want to pause on this idea. I want to pause for a minute and think about this idea of the margin as a space of radical openness. And one of the people that comes to mind is Bell Hooks. And you'll hear me refer to Bell Hooks quite a bit in her essay about choosing the margin as a space of radical openness. And this is one of the things that I want us to discuss because Bell Hooks is challenging us to think differently about what it means to be on the outside, to be on the margins of life. And for Hooks, the margin is not just a place. If we read some of her works here, the margins are not a place just of exclusion, but a place of resistance and creativity where it all comes together. I was thinking about this last night in my sleep because this is what I do. We think of Bell Hooks and how she writes about living and thinking from margins. And this allows us to see the dominant culture very, very clearly because we're not swallowed up by it, right? So from that edge, from that fringe, if you will, we can imagine new ways of being, new ways of relating to each other, new ways of seeing the world around us through these people who live on the fringes. So now if we take a look at someone like Hobo Shoestring, who spends his life moving through spaces, right? He spent most of his life moving through spaces that most you and I would never see. A boxcar, a grainer, a rail yard in the middle of the night, whatever it is. Train yards, small towns, in between places, hobo camps, all this other stuff, right? And we're looking at somebody, if you look at Hobo Shoestring, you were looking at someone who has, intentionally or not, right, made his life a kind of social philosophy. And so we can learn a lot from people like Mark Nichols, also known as Hobo Shoestrings, because he's not following the map that most of us were given, that most of us were told to follow. Hobo Shoestring was kind of following his own path, right? So let's think about these margins and these people that do crazy things by societal definitions. Let's think of them more in the context of this course as laboratories for innovation. Okay? Because there's a real practical side to all of this, if we look at it, is that innovation often comes from constraint. It comes from resistance. People living on the fringe of society become masters of improv. They do. They fix things with limited tools. They're finding beauty in the scarcity of things like food. and they're inventing community resources from within. Scarcity breeds innovation, right? Okay? Think of the Great Depression during the height of the hobo movement. And I'm a big fan of this hobo movement, right? But if you think about this, how it evolved out of the Great Depression, people reaching for desperation, they were able to innovate much bigger, much brighter, because things were scarce. So, in that sense, of fringe living is a kind of problem solving that we're all getting into and that we're all looking at today. How do we solve these problems? Okay. How can I make something work with nothing? What can I do to improve the world without fully being in the system? And I think that what matters more to this is what matters enough to keep and what can I throw away? That's the real question. So, this mindset of the innovator, the person on the fringe, whatever, if you really look at this, it's all about adaptability, creativity under constraint, right? All of these things drive scientific discovery. It drives art. It drives social innovation. And this may not be the normal path that most of us look at. Let me close the blind here so we can see a little bit. There we go. So, of course, there's danger in all of this, right? There's a real danger to living in this world. And when we study people who live on the margins, we have to be careful not to romanticize this too much, right? Not to exploit them and not to give them too much credit, if you will, right? Because there is some danger to living on the fringes. And that's why throughout this course, we're going to look at this with the emphasis of ethical observation, learning to see what we can learn with respect from these people. And we're going to discuss how to engage with media critically, how to recognize our own assumptions, and how to listen without judgment. Okay, how to free ourselves from the Netflix world of zombies and witches and warlocks. How to free ourselves from the zombie culture, which is in 2025, as I record this, seems to be everywhere because this bullshit leads you to a world not to think because they don't want you to be a thinker. They just want you to watch the next goddamn zombie show or the next goddamn witch show about the good witch or whatever because it was successful once. They don't want you to think. Well, what happens when we do start thinking? We're ripping safety away from them. So media plays a big part in this. So as we begin this course, I want you to think about certain things. I want you to think about this not as a typical academic subject, but as an experiment in seeing, in understanding, in listening, in being able to take something from nothing and turn it into to real innovation. I'm going to ask you to do some very difficult things. I'm going to ask you to observe things. I'm going to ask you to question things. More importantly, I'm going to ask you to imagine things. I want you to ask yourself, what do I really need in life? What do I really value in life? And more importantly, at the end of this, I want you to ask yourself, what do I really need to find meaning and find purpose? And perhaps most importantly, what does freedom look like for you? What does it look like for you if you dared to redefine it. If you dared to throw out the map and redefine freedom and success, what does it mean to you? So, to sum this whole thing up, that in a world that measures success by accumulation, right? The fringes of society reminds us that there is another way to measure life, through presence, through adaptability, through connection, and through imagination. This is life. This is really living life very creative. And we're going to ask ourselves what we can learn, what characters like Bell Hooks and Hobo Shoestring, Hobo Stove, these people, what can they teach us about being more fully, more freely, and more creatively, more innovatively alive? What can we learn from them? The good, the bad, and the ugly. That's the beauty of it. That's what this whole thing is about.